Hello everyone, good afternoon, and welcome to this public meeting of the Standing Committee on Government Operations. My name is Julian Morse. I'm the MLA for Frame Lake and Chair of the Standing Committee on Government Operations. Today we have Honorable Minister of Finance Carolyn Wozniak, who is present to present about the Northwest Territories Heritage Fund. Please note that this meeting is being live streamed to the Assembly's social media channels, and my understanding is we are also live on TV, which is a rare and exciting occurrence. I will now ask members in the room and online to introduce themselves for the record. I'll start with Mr. Rogers.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm Denny Rogers, the MLA for Nuvik-Boot Lake. Welcome, and thank you for taking the time this afternoon to come and give us an update.
Good afternoon. I'm MLA Kate Reed for Great Slave.
Good afternoon. Robert Hawkins, MLA for Yellowknife Centre, and as always, happy to be here.
Hi there, Shauna Morgan, MLA for Yellowknife North.
And online?
Okay. Jane Wayellen Armstrong, MLA for Montfee, Cleacher Region.
Wonderful, thank you. So I would just like to remind all members and witnesses to direct all questions and comments to myself as chair. It helps us with organizing the audio-visual, and wait to be recognized before speaking so we can have a smooth meeting. I will now pass it on to Minister Wozniak. Please introduce your officials and proceed with your presentation. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Thanks for having us here. With me today, first introductions, Caroline Wozniak, of course, Minister of Finance, but also MLA for Yellowknife South. And with me today on my right, Deputy Minister of Finance, Bill McKay, the Director of Fiscal Policy on my left, Kelly Bluck, and seated behind us, Ministerial Special Advisor Drew Robertson and the Acting Senior Advisor to the Deputy Minister of Finance, Michael Shahi. The purpose of the Heritage Fund, just to give a few opening remarks, Mr. Chair, before we go straight into the presentation, is to save resource revenues from non-renewable resources extracted today for the benefit of future generations. The Heritage Fund legislation establishes a long-term investment fund that receives contributions of resource revenues that are transferred at the discretion of the Legislative Assembly through the budgeting process. The NWT has been contributing to the fund since 2012, and following devolution for the management of lands, waters, and non-renewable resources on April 1st, 2014, we've transferred almost $41 million to the fund. The fund's value is close to $50 million today. Starting in 2032, the Legislative Assembly can withdraw a portion of the income generated in the fund, provided that the principal of the fund is not removed. We do have a presentation prepared to describe the mechanics of this legacy for future generations of Northerners, and this concludes opening remarks. Be happy to go into the presentation, Mr. Chair.
By all means, we've got the audio-visual ready to go a bit. Looks like it. So yeah, please proceed with the presentation. Thanks.
Okay. All right, thank you, Minister. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and MLAs for inviting us to present on the NWT Heritage Fund. We have a short presentation that I'll run through, and then we can answer questions from the committee arising from that presentation. So I'll turn to the second slide now. All right, so the slide just sort of outlines for members of the committee the rationale behind establishing the Heritage Fund. So as committee knows, non-renewable assets are assets that belong to all residents of the NWT, but they're also one-time in nature. So development and extraction turns those physical assets into revenue and depletes the inventory of what's in the ground. So as being non-renewable, they're a dwindling resource. So if they're spent immediately, they go into general revenues, and only today's population benefits from it. So as a way of creating intergenerational fairness, the Heritage Fund was established so that it could set aside money for future generations to benefit from royalty extraction. The next slide, please. So the fund's purpose, like I said, is to save some non-renewable resource revenues for future generations. Non-renewable revenue is also directed to capital investments for legacy infrastructure and debt repayment. So in that way, the revenues from non-renewable resources are targeted to benefit both today's population as well as future generations. The fund is built up by retaining both the contributions and income generated for the first 20 years as principal with no withdrawals allowed. So we're still in that 20-year period, and the balance of the Heritage Fund is building up. So in 2032-33, subject to limits, a maximum of 5% a year can be removed from the Heritage Fund, and then after that, all of the deposits are still considered principal. And this is governed by the Northwest Territories Heritage Fund Act and regulation, and those regulations outline how this money can be invested and what type of what percentage the principal of the fund can go to different investments. So next slide, NWT Heritage Fund contributions. Each legislative assembly approves the contribution to the fund through the annual budget. So when the budget comes to you, there'll be there's an appropriation for a contribution to the Heritage Fund, and that represents an estimate by the Department of Finance as to what amount we will be collecting in royalties and what percent, and then applying the calculation outlined in the regulations and the legislation as to what should be allocated towards the Heritage Fund. So under the Northwest Territories Lands and Resource Devolution Agreement, the GNWT keeps 50% of the resource revenues, so the net fiscal benefit is that 50%. And the GNWT also shares 25% of that net fiscal benefit with Indigenous government signatories. So in the end, 25% of the total royalties are retained by the GNWT as revenues. Next slide, please. So this slide, Mr. Chair, just outlines the contributions that have been made to the Heritage Fund over the course of the years. So since 2012, when it's established, there was a seed deposit of $250,000 a year that was made to the Heritage Fund, and then from then on, royalties as well as license fees were added to the Heritage Fund, again according to the formula that I outlined earlier. So as you can see, it has gone up and down over the course of the years, but there has been contributions every year to the Heritage Fund. Next slide, please. So this pie chart here, Mr. Chair, just outlines again for committee how the royalties are divided up. So the first is the 50% goes to the federal government. Now this is paid to the federal government as an offset against TFF, so that's there's a 2-year time lag. So the GNWT will collect 100% of royalties, but then 50% of what they've collected is actually reduced from TFF within the next 2 years. So that's how that federal contribution is paid. And then the other part is paid, as it says here, 12.5%, so that's the 25% that goes to the Indigenous governments, but once you take off the federal share, that is 12.5% of the total amount of royalties that the GNWT collects will go to Indigenous governments, and then 9.4% on this is contributed to the Heritage Fund, so that's $3.2 million, and then the remaining net fiscal benefit of $9.5 million goes into general revenues, but as I said, we generally try to allocate that to capital expenditures so that royalties from non-renewable resources are spent on lasting assets that have a lasting impact to the territory. Next slide, please. The fund has been managed by CIBC Wood Gundy, so they are professional asset managers. I'm sure everybody's heard of them. So that since 2019, that's been managed by CIBC Wood Gundy. The fund's investment strategies outlined in the Act to maximize long-term returns without undue risk. And then the regulations, as I mentioned before, impose several conditions on the investments. So acceptable issuers are generally Canadian governments and banks, and allowed investments are fixed income, so short-term paper and bonds that meet strict credit quality standards. So they're very safe investments. And then 25% of the portfolio is in equities. And then there's maximums under each of these, and so that no single investment within each of those, no single bond or no single equity can dominate the fund, so it can be shifted over so that balance is maintained. The financial statements of the fund are published annually and show the earnings and contributions made during the year and the change in assets from the previous year to the current year, and they're set out in the public accounts and are reviewed by the Auditor General of Canada. Next slide. This slide outlines the Heritage Fund performance. So since moving to independent management in 2019, Heritage Fund compounded annual returns have been 5.9% compared to 6.4% for the TSX. But keep in mind that the Heritage Fund is only 25% equity, so the TSX would generally have a little bit better performance than the Heritage Fund returns, but that's because the Heritage Fund is more heavily invested in more income investments or safe investments. And then also is less volatile than the TSX. So you'll see the chart there shows what the returns have been since 2019 as compared to the TSX, and the returns on the Heritage Fund have been a little more steady or less volatile than the TSX. Next slide, please. So again, this shows in sort of a visual with the amounts for committee members, the current value of the fund, which is around 48 million. It might be a bit more. This was of March 31st, 2024, so it's a bit more now. But as I outlined before, we generally have fixed income at around 54.5%, short-term, and those are short-term fixed income, so short-term bonds, and then medium-term bonds and other fixed income instruments are at 9.8%, 10.9% in cash and equivalents, and 0.05% in dividends, 0.5% in accrued interest, and then the 24.2% right now is in equity, and again, it can't be more than 25%. The next slide, please. So just to give committee an idea of where we see the Heritage Fund growing to, we see it going to around 74 million over the next 5 years, and this would be compounded annual growth of 8%. And that includes contributions. So for 24-25 to 28-29, contributions will be $12 million and income representing a $14 million increase to the fund. The next slide. So just as a reminder to committee, there are within the legislation a 10-year review which is required. Then the review is going to be required to look at the operations of the Act itself, along with other recommendations for amendments that may come up from MLAs or government when reviewing the legislation. It will also address when the fund can be withdrawn and spent, and what kind of spending it will be directed towards. And we also expect that the review would include a consideration of amendments that can be made on oversight and management and other administrative issues. So the Legislative Assembly has started the process now for the Act's first review, which is due, I think, in 2022, so we're a bit overdue on that. So that'll be sometime during this Legislative Assembly. So that's the end of the presentation, Mr. Chair. So as I mentioned, we're here to answer any questions that committee may have. So thank you for your time, and I'll turn it over to the Minister now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for that presentation. Of course, I'll now go to members for questions. I have Ms. Reid first, and members, please just wave your hand at me and we'll get you on the list. Go ahead, Ms. Reid.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you very much for your presentation. In your presentation, you spoke today about the contributions and the royalties breakdown and the percentages behind those royalties and where they go. But on slide 5, in the contribution history, can you provide more clarity around what percentage fee that you're putting into the Heritage Fund regarding the licenses, fees, and work bids? What sets the parameters for that? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Over to the Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, we were only breaking that out there to demonstrate the portion of the total that is from other as opposed to the mineral oil and gas. It's all, actually, maybe I just want to make sure I'm understanding. It's just the percent division of each, or the dollar value. Sorry, Mr. Chair.
Ms. Reid, clarify.
Thanks, and thanks to the Minister. Sorry if I wasn't clear. So is it considered separate, or is it all considered a totality, and that is the percentage that you're working with? If the breakdown is just for clarity of what's coming in, that's all it is, I guess. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Okay, thanks. Back to the minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, Mr. Chair, it's all total. So it's like that total amount is what then gets divided. 50% goes back to the federal government, and then the division of net 25% to Indigenous governments. We were breaking it down because there was a couple of years where there was an unusually high amount that came in as a result of the work bid licensing issue, and that so just to show that the work bids made that difference. Really, it's just showing the different types of revenue that come in under this. But yeah, the percentage division applies to this total number. I hope that's clear.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Reid, do you have a follow-up?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. Switching gears a little bit, towards the end of your presentation, you spoke about the need for, or the desire for, any legislative changes. I'm curious as to what the department sees as being beneficial legislative changes to the Act at this time. Thank you.
Thank you. And to the minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, there's no legislative proposal right now being contemplated, so there's no set parameters that are being put forward at this time. Thanks. I mean, the review is scheduled to happen, so I suppose any changes would flow from what the outcomes of that review would be.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Rogers, you're next on the list.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My questions are more around the investment strategy and oversight of the fund. And I know I've read the Act and I've read the regulations, but we haven't seen an investment strategy. So I understand that Wood Gundy has taken the fund over as of 2019, which I don't think is a bad thing. But so obviously Wood Gundy would have investment managers in there, and maybe speaking more on the equity side. I know on the bonds it's probably fairly straightforward, especially if it's Canadian bonds. You're looking at bonds and T-bills and so on and so forth. But on the equity side, like, do they have the J.P. Morgans or Jaslowski Frasers, or who do they report on which equity firms you're using? And then in that reporting, are they looking at benchmarks? You mentioned the TSX and whether or not we hold the investment managers to a certain benchmark. Typically, I guess, in a fund, and our fund is not huge compared to, I'm sure, some of the funds these guys are managing, but typically you would have a 1, 2, or 3 strike scenario with the managers when they come in. I'm assuming they come in at least semi-annually or maybe even quarterly to meet and to review what their portfolios are doing. So is a part of our management, I guess, part of that? Are we that deep into the weeds, or do we have that kind of investment strategy where we can say what the benchmark should be? You need to outperform a certain benchmark. If you don't in 3 quarters, then you're out, and we'll go and find someone else who can. And is that kind of how it's, I guess, functioning at the current time? Thank you.
Thank you. Over to the minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So, yeah, Mr. Chair, there's not a whole lot more in terms of a legislated or required or mandated strategy beyond what is in the regulations. So it's pretty simple in that sense. There's the cap on equity, the focus being on really ensuring a long-term return as opposed to maybe a faster or bigger or more risky return, which could obviously yield better results but comes with greater risk. They do come in to meet with the Department of Finance, I believe, annually. But that is, even the fact that it's been managed is somewhat new, and certainly, from what I am aware, has performed better. There's not the level of the in-the-weeds management that the members describing. Thank you.
Thank you, and over to Mr. Rogers for follow-up.
Thank you for that, and thank you, Mr. Chair. So is that something that we're contemplating? And I say that, I mean, we review an annual budget, and obviously our budget's much bigger and a whole, and we talk about $10,000 for e-bikes, but yet we have a fund that when we got our initial orientation when we came in as MLAs, this one was, I'm not going to say, I guess, an afterthought, it's probably not the right word, but it's certainly something that wasn't on our radar like the annual budget or like the annual capital budget. So it seems to me, given that we're in a situation where, any revenue we can find, we're certainly looking for that. And do we need to look at how that strategy is set up? Do we need, is it time? And when the decision was made to go 25% equity, maybe it's time to go 30, maybe it's time to go 50, and maybe it's time to look at our investments a little closer and maybe have, through a committee of cabinet, I assume, or a committee of DMs, to have someone a little more in the weeds and oversight on that, and have obviously investment manager, which you have with Wood Gundy, but then have that kind of also get a little deeper and find out who's actually investing our money and how that performance is going per each investor. Is that something that, if, I guess, Cabinet or as a government we're contemplating? Thank you.
Thank you. And to the Minister for response, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, I think that is exactly the kinds of questions we need to ask ourselves looking at this fund. I don't disagree that in a time where we are facing significant impacts and challenges to revenue sources, but particularly draws upon the need for expenditures, the fact that there's $50 million sitting here, are we doing the best we can with it? Now, of course, we can invest more aggressively. That may be something that can come out of the review. Those regulations wouldn't change without coming back through the Legislative Assembly, just at least to get the sense of where folks are at and where we as want this to go. We can be more aggressive with it, but I think the first question to ask ourselves probably is for what purpose and what do we want to do with the fund? And if it is meant to be, again, really long-term in its focus, being more aggressive will, of course, bring more risk. We can then stay the course. We could put more parameters to even be less risky, or more parameters to say we want to have it long-term but be more growth-oriented. I mean, those, it's the kind of thing that if you go to a bank to get an RRSP, your banker's probably going to ask you those basic questions, and we can ask ourselves that too. So, again, this is the time where we're coming into being a review, and those are exactly the kind of questions I think that we should ask ourselves. What's the purpose of the fund, and how do we want best to achieve it? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I have Mr. Hawkins next. I'm going to stick to the two, but we'll do a second round. Mr. Hawkins.
Yes. Yeah. You tell that member, Mr. Chair. You tell him. I guess some of the concerns, of course, similar to Mr. Rogers, is its overall performance, and I guess I'd start by asking out loud, like, how bad does it have to get, or how low does it have to perform before it triggers some type of signal to say, hey, maybe we're going in the wrong direction? Because it would be normal to have performance objectives on fund managers. So I guess, why are MLAs asking this question? Why isn't the minister asking this question? Why isn't someone from the department? You've been minister for 5 years. I suspect there's been some discussion about the Heritage Fund in the carriage of this file over that period. So I'm curious, what will trigger to do things differently, I guess. Thank you.
Thank you. Over to the minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So, Mr. Chair, one of the things that did change since I was in this role is that we've shifted to having professional managers of this fund, which has improved the performance of the fund. The fundamental purpose of the goal, or fundamental purpose of this fund, set from before my time in politics, was for this to be a long-term fund from which we would not be drawing out any kind of assets anytime in the near future, leaving, therefore, me to simply be reporting back and ensuring that as a long-term investment, we were maintaining a risk profile that reflected that. We are now at a time where, by legislation, we are going to have a review of whether or not this continues to be what we want. We, as the Northwest Territories Society, reflected by its leadership here, want as the purpose for its fund. That is a question that is not for me alone to ask or answer. I can certainly pose it and organize the engagement strategy, but that will be where that will have to unfold, and it will not be for me alone to decide. I have a view on it, I may have opinions on it, but we will want to go back out and make sure that this is a fulsome process of determining if, in fact, we want to be changing the approach that we have to the money that is sitting there. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Hawkins, do you have a follow-up?
I'm just a little conflicted, and I can tell you that, the finance minister and the department can immediately come up in their couple of experts saying, this is our fiscal strategy, and members, here it is. The government's going to cut this much money, and this is the way we're going. But the fund could be going off the cliff, and I'm hearing, well, we'll have to wait till it triggers. I guess I'm trying to say is that, under the stewardship of the department, I would have hoped they'd be sending broader signals, because the fund, although it appears to have made some money, it just seems like it's based on the principles, what's its savior. I think that there needs to be better public reporting on this and public measurement. Now, I know the Minister in Defense will come back and say it's in public accounts, be that as it may. That is not a timely response, and I guess I would ask it's unfortunate this gets dumped on members. So I would say, what can the department, and certainly what would the department be willing to do to ensure that there's better transparency on what the fund is making and costing? Because the public really at large has no idea what it's doing other than hearing we have a fund. And if you said, well, go to the public accounts, that's not true public accountability from the general citizen's point of view. It might be from a legislator point of view or an accountant point of view, but it's not from the day-to-day citizens. So what can you do on that essence? Thank you.
Thanks. Over to the Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So again, a couple of things I think that are put there. So and again, firstly, the fund hasn't done badly in the last few years. It actually is tracking with, roughly tracking with the TSX, despite the fact that we are not even actually, as Deputy Minister mentioned, put in a position to fully utilize the potentially higher returns from a stronger TSX representation within the fund. So, it is doing all right in that regard. And also despite the fact that over the last few years, there were two pretty low resource revenue years, which, again, that's the contribution and not the actual reflection of how the fund is performing. But, if you're putting less in, that certainly isn't going to help the overall outcomes of the fund. I will just note, if this wasn't clear, that the slide where we were actually demonstrating the performance, we do back out the total amounts that are going in under the principle, so as to actually demonstrate performance as it is for performance, and not only by the fact that there may be ongoing contributions, in particular when there's the years when there's the high work bid contributions. So again, to achieve the goals of a long-term non-risk return, it is achieving those goals. Whether we are at a point where we want to question ourselves as to whether or not this is how we want to manage the overall fiscal picture of the government of the Northwest Territories, this is an opportunity to do that. And this is a year when we have come forward and said this is the year to do that. So I don't think there's any disconnect in terms of the timing of those things. Lastly, in terms of where we might want to publicly report, I do hope that people would be interested in looking at the public accounts. But beyond that, there's certainly any of the other mechanisms of government and public reporting that are available, and we can certainly put more information out on a website. I, again, would be quite thrilled if people took that level of interest in this. Always happy to answer questions, happy to do presentations such as the one we're in right now, and could certainly include this in the annual budget documents that we put forward every year during the budget session. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I have Ms. Morgan on the list for the next question.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I mean, I wanted to just step back for a minute and ask, and I don't imagine you have the answers right now, but I think this could go into the public consultation. But I think if people in the public think about this at all, which they may not even be aware that it's there, the question is often, if this is meant to be something that creates intergenerational fairness, we talk about these very broad, sweeping, idealistic ideas, and that, we're taking non-renewable resources out that we'll never get back again, and we're somehow trying to pay back future generations or make up for the fact that we're taking something away from future generations they can never get back. Like, how much is enough to make it meaningful? Is the idea that anything is better than nothing, and so whatever we end up with, in another, or 20 years' time from the time it's established is like, great job, we did it? Or how will we know if it was good enough, or we have enough to achieve what we're trying to achieve? And I think part of the problem, and you touched on this, is we don't know what we're trying to ultimately achieve through the fund. In the Act, lots of process-oriented things are set out about how it will be done, but it's not clear because we don't have clear objectives on what we're actually going to achieve or accomplish for future generations at the end of the day. And if we knew that, we might be able to better work back. Are we setting aside enough? Is it going to be enough to cover whatever it is we're going to start trying to achieve? I forget the date now. Is it 2032 or whenever we can start withdrawing money from the interest. So I guess the question is the plan through this review to come out with some clear objectives that would be meaningful to the public in terms of knowing what we're trying to achieve and then being able to hold the government to account and measure, like, are we getting there? Are we doing a good job? Are we setting aside enough money or not? Because at this point, I think the general sense is we're setting aside a little bit of money. Is it enough? Who knows? For what? Who knows? So are these kind of discussions happening internally, or is the plan to do that through public consultation at this point? Thanks.
Thank you, and over to the minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And first, let me just be, I don't have the act quoted in front of me. I could certainly get that. It's obviously publicly available, but the review is, if I'm not mistaken, it's the first session after 10 years. So we really are right on that mark here with 2024. And, you know, I mean, obviously it's within the hands of the Legislative Assembly to go back to legislation and change it if we wanted to do that sooner. But we really are right on time. And I don't think we want to lose the opportunity to have the conversation. You know, this is really, having the opportunity to come forward here is in some ways sort of a step one on that. Like it's not due yet, and that we're technically still before our, you know, first session of the 10 years mark. So, you know, we're on time to be beginning the conversation to figure out, yeah, what is the purpose? The purpose has likely changed since 10 years ago. The situation of the economy may well have changed since 10 years ago. The political visions may well have changed since 10 years ago. And, you know, I'd have to look back to what the vision of the politicians then at the time, what they had hoped to achieve of it. Have we achieved that? And has the situation changed that what was hoped to be achieved really is no longer a priority? Yeah, it is not something that I have an answer to today. It is the beginning of the conversation. I mean, even just understanding what, and something that we've only just begun to talk about, you know, myself and the deputy very recently, is what even would qualify as an investment in the future. So to date, it's been on capital investments, not on operations. Is there an argument that there are some types of operations that can be an investment in the future? You know, education. But then what kind of education? And at what level? And at what amount? And is this enough? So, a question with a question. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Over to Ms. Morgan for follow-up.
Oh, gotcha. Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. And I definitely appreciate those kinds of questions being asked in terms of what is a meaningful investment in the future. I would also note that, you know, a substantial portion of the Heritage Fund, of resource revenues are allocated to, you know, capital as an investment in the future, and then a little bit is allocated to the Heritage Fund. But the argument being, as I understand it, that just as the Heritage Fund is an investment in the future, so is capital, that they're sort of interchangeable theoretically in some ways. However, I don't know to what extent we analyze, like if we're investing in capital that has a lifespan of 5 years or 10 years, is that truly, and I know that many capital investments are much longer, but some might be shorter or require, you know, significant maintenance or replacement or that on an ongoing basis. And so at what point is it not really a meaningful investment in future generations? We're just building things that constantly need to be repaired and maintained. So I would echo that there are some investments in, say, ongoing things, O&M, that do make a significant difference for future generations. And I would also argue that we should be examining which of our capital investments are truly, you know, leaving a legacy for future generations, and which are just giving us stuff that could become a liability in 5 years, you know. Is there consideration of having an annual report that's more accessible to the public that could help explain to people, like, okay, the idea is to provide a legacy or investment for future generations, so we've put this much in Heritage Fund, and this is what else we've spent our resource revenues on, And we believe that it's, investing in a legacy for the future, but putting that out to the public so people can actually see that this is, what the capital investment was, and this is intended to be, a replacement for the value of the resources that we're losing, just to, make people think and have more accountability around, are we truly using the resource revenues to invest in the future? And I think we've had this discussion a little bit too around, carbon tax revenues, and does it need to be linked to specific things that people can see, and is that important? I would argue it is important for people to be able to link the money coming from resource revenues to something tangible that we're investing in for the future. But is there a consideration of having annual reporting that more clearly explains to people how we're investing our resource revenues to show investment in future generations? Thank you.
Thank you. Over to the Minister for response.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, I'm going to be at a loss on that one. I mean, in that there's again quite a lot to unpack, and yeah, the differing nature of capital, how long it'll last. I mean, that would be a fascinating thing that I think the Department of Infrastructure would probably be very keen to come in and to go over the. And in fact, I have something coming to you probably in the near future about how we do chip seal planning and road maintenance and the longevity of the same. So. And would be different for housing assets, and would be different for large assets, and would be different depending upon the deferred maintenance on the assets and anyway. So, yeah, I certainly don't have in one place a report on every single one of those items. And those would be the other items, types of items on which the resource royalties would have been directed. But back more generally to a report on the use of resource revenue. And so, yeah, we can certainly, again, report more specifically on the Heritage Fund and put more out publicly and maybe generate a bit more interest in its existence and its operation. Open to ideas on, as I said, whether that's simply more on the website, something in the budget papers. Those are all options. I don't know that those places get as much traction as we might hope sometimes, but we could certainly try. Yeah, and I my last sort of comment, Mr. Chair, it's a bit of caution that there's the resource royalties and the fees and the licenses which are reflected here, but then there's also a lot of sometimes indirect and associated benefits that we aren't necessarily going to reflect in the Heritage Fund that are coming from the same business operations. I mean, there's taxes that we collect from the same business operations that are not here, often more. Then there's payroll and personal income taxes paid by all the employees who are employed there. So it's just difficult to try to get to a place where we say with the resource industry in the Northwest Territories has resulted in X dollars. And the Heritage Fund is one reflection of it, but it's only one piece of even the revenue that we're getting from those operations. So I agree that finding a way to better encapsulate that is huge. It's probably beyond the scope of what the Department of Finance is going to be in a position to do. All that said, getting a bit more attention onto the Heritage Fund is not a bad thing as we go into the year when the Legislative Assembly needs to do its review. So, thanks.
Okay, thank you. Going into a second round now, I have Mr. Rogers first up.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just kind of following up on my earlier line of questions, and I mean, I get it. The fund is fairly young, relatively speaking, and I get that. And I think that I applaud the department for step one, getting an investment manager. And I think if you look at your chart on page 8 and see the discrepancy between the TSX and the S&P, you can see that was a good move. I see we missed a bit of a bump in 21 and 22 there, and I can see why. So, I mean, I guess if and I'm assuming the department may or may not have done this, but to do the analysis to say what would have been the result if we had index funds or, heaven forbid, ETFs rather than just having the strategy that we have, and how much more funds will we have there, because certainly I don't think spending the money will be a problem if we start making more. I'm sure we can all come up with innovative ways to do that. But I do think that as we move forward, that we do need to look at kind of at least at least meeting the indices, right? As to coming in below it. I don't think there's a lot of risk to that. So I wonder, I guess my question then, Mr. Chair, is has the department looked at that and said, what if? I get it that it's 6.4 to 5.9 now, but if you look back in 21, 22, again, we missed a bit of a bump there, I think, where we weren't in those funds. So is that something the department is looking, or is that, and I get it if that's part of the review, and I assume it will be as we go forward, and I think it's great that we're doing that. And I think, again, step one, hiring a money manager. Step two will be the strategic analysis to find out what it should look like going forward. So thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Over to the Minister for response.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So, Mr. Chair, one thing that I think both, the department has made clear is the approach here and the strategy that is in their regulations, and that was, I think, detailed a little bit more today. It is similar to other public funds, and that is something I had asked, was to get a sense of whether what we're doing with this, and with our resource royalties, is wildly different than what other provinces and territories are doing, or roughly aligned with. And it is in fact aligned with other similar public funds. So, you know, in that sense, we're not particularly risk averse. We're not unusually risk averse. I'm sure we could run numbers to try to see what might be done differently. There are obviously going to be a number of variables. In general, we are taking, at this point in time, advice from Wood Gundy, who are the professional managers, within the parameters that are set within the regulations that we are operating under right now. But again, you know, the conversation to be had, and it's heading into the review from the Legislative Assembly, will be whether or not that we can do something different than other public funds. We don't have to do the same thing as other public funds. I suspect you may run up against perhaps some philosophical differences that are even present within the room between being a bit more risk friendly, getting more returns, but then looking at what we're doing with resource money that's coming from an item that will, from a resource that we will never get back. So that will be the challenge, but again, the questions are good to lead off into what will be the discussion on this item over the next couple of years. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Rogers, follow-up?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And yes, and I agree, and thank you for that answer. I will say, and likely because we didn't have a fund manager prior to 2019, if you do compare us to other jurisdictions in our investment, we haven't performed as well as they have. So we may be following their investment strategy, but we're certainly not implementing that strategy, I guess, as keenly as other jurisdictions have. But I appreciate what the Minister is saying, and again, look forward to the review and how we can look at, I guess, better managing this money to make a little more, and then we can all decide how we want to spend that money. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. That's not really a question, but I'll give the Minister an opportunity to respond in case she likes to.
Yeah, no, just not to, that I don't disagree, that having it professionally managed is appropriate. That much I would suggest shouldn't change, no matter what changes we might otherwise make. So yeah, that certainly is, they're experts in this space. Thanks.
Thank you. I have Ms. Reid next.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And this question, I hope, sort of bridges a little bit of the divide between Ms. Morgan and Mr. Rogers, because it's pragmatic and principled. I like it. So, the International Forum of Sovereign Wealth Funds has created in 2008, I believe it is, 24 generally acceptable principles and practices known as the Santiago Principles. They're globally recognized. I assume, but maybe assumptions aren't a good thing to make, that finance was aware of these when we did create the fund. However, I'm curious to know if this is going to be something in the review that maybe we can dig into further, but what Santiago principles does our fund meet and where we might be deficient? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Over to the Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I wasn't here in 2014 when the fund was created, so I don't know. Yeah, perhaps somebody else in the room who was here would know what the answer to that is. No, I wasn't here when it was created, so let me take that one away and see whether or to what degree that was part of the contemplation at the time. And certainly put another bookmark on it that, again, and it is a review of the Legislative Assembly. So this isn't just an internal finance, Department of Finance review. So to the extent that people in this room may be particularly interested in how this review might unfold, my bookmark was that that might be some of the principles on which the review might want it to take its starting point. So but let me take it back, as I said, and see to what extent it was considered back in the day. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Reid, follow-up?
Thank you, and thanks for that. I didn't necessarily expect a fulsome answer today, so appreciate the minister's response. My second question is leading along a little bit with Mr. Rogers had to say earlier around our investment strategy. I'm curious, can that is there a way to make that investment strategy public and transparent? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Over to the Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So there's already the basic details that are in the regulations, and some of the explanation that was provided. I would think that we can, again, discussing options of putting some more information on our website and putting details into the budget papers, which are really only a few months away. I mean, that may be the place to put a bit more meat onto the bones that are in the regs. There's certainly no secrecy to them in that regard. So happy to make sure that however we move forward to make this more public, that we include the provisions around, or the details around what they include. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Do we have further questions from committee? Mr. Hawkins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And just to make sure it's not missed, I would encourage it to be publicly reported in every budget document, given the opportunity of where it is current to state. As my earlier question, just briefly, the everyday person does not understand the budget documents in the form they come in, let alone certain styles of statements. So I would encourage a plain language page that explains what's been done, where it's going, and our hopes and objectives. Now, if they want something further, then they can bug their MLA or whoever. But I mean, and then we can bug the Department of Finance. So ultimately, the transparency. So my question, Mr. Chairman, really is going to be built around the custodian of our fund. And I think it's probably I think it's fairly reasonable to assume they're knowledgeable about our fund and objectives. So in other words, the Heritage Fund, the responsibilities, what they have carriage for. I mean, I'm sure that's the overall interview and concept when they discuss it, taking on this challenge. So I doubt they do their work in a vacuum. So I'm curious as to what recommendations they make, or what recommendations we make, or is there any recommendations and conversations that are appropriate to the direction of the fund? And so I think there'd be some real value in hearing their thoughts, and I'm curious what has been discussed, what has been proposed, because I can't imagine even the current person since the last few years has not, I can't only imagine they haven't reviewed the fund and reviewed the performance and not made any suggestions whatsoever. So I'd be curious what they may or may not be. Thank you.
Thank you. Over to the Minister for a response.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, Kelly Bluck is the lead on this, so this has come up a couple times. I'd suggest perhaps I ask her to just detail a little bit more what those interactions are like, please.
Go ahead.
Mr. Chair, we talk to, so Wood Gundy is our investment managers. They give us a monthly report on what everything is happening in the fund. We talk to them what routinely is annually. We have a chat with them where they actually describe their thinking and what the markets have been doing, how they were switching things around. If we want or we're concerned, when we get the monthly report, we could actually just pick up the phone to them. It's two individuals that we talk to all the time. We ask them periodically, are our regulations what you guys need to do to maximize our returns while minimizing our risk? Because that's the instructions of our policy and the contract that we gave them. And in fact, the regulations that we have now are a reflection of what we've looked at other funds of a similar size, and also what Wood Gundy said is what they feel is appropriate given our investment goals, which is to maximize risk while maximize returns while minimizing risk.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Hawkins for follow-up.
Thank you. Would the custodian, and I appreciate that, would the custodian be making any recommendations on how to do the fund better? In other words, re-engineer an approach, change regulations, you know, and if so, what types of examples could you provide? Because I can't imagine them just saying, you know, hey, this is the best we can do without doing anything, you know. In other words, we're safe. That's what I mean about not doing anything. I suspect they'd say we could do better if we considered X, Y, Z, but if you don't want to consider X, Y, Z, then that's okay too, because they're following the instructions of the client, which is the NWT. So I'm curious on what type of recommendations they would provide to assist the performance of the overall fund. They must provide something, I could imagine. Thank you.
Thank you. Over to the department for a response.
Kelly, please.
Go ahead, Ms. Pluck.
Mr. Chair, they do give advice, but the advice that they have given is that they think we, with the composition that we have, that's appropriate for the fund size that we have. In other words, equities of 25% is what they recommend, and that is what we have put into the regulations. They have made recommendations that it would do their job better if we had better, if we could also invest in commercial bonds, and we change the regulations to reflect that as well. So they come up with those advice, but we do ask that question of them periodically, are we sure that we're doing best? And they again assure us that what we have there is what they feel is appropriate, given that our direction to them is to maximize returns while minimizing risk.
Okay, thank you. Do we have further questions for round one? I see a round, or sorry, for round two. Seeing none, we can jump into round three. Mr. Rogers.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just quickly, and I was done, but Mr. Hawkins tweaked something. But I guess that's the rub, right? I mean, it's direction we give them, and you know, and I have no doubt that the department and everyone is doing exactly what they should be doing and getting their monthly reports, and I think that's great. But I think based on the fact that we are very high, very low risk tolerance, right? So of course they're going to come back and say, based on the information that we have, the direction we have from you, this is what, and I don't doubt that in the least. And any other fund manager or any other director would do exactly the same thing. My question is, and again, and I know this is coming up, so when we do that, when that review is done, is it time to maybe take a look at that direction and see how we want to change our investment strategy a little, maybe take a little more risk to at least meet or exceed somewhat the indices as we go forward. Thank you.
Thanks. Over to the minister.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. So, I mean, again, if the Legislative Assembly in the doing of the review decides that with these resource revenues that we have, this element of them, that we want to seek to use them in a different way, well, then that is the direction that the Department of Finance would get. It is public money. So there's that, you know, that's probably why it's not very different for others. I mean, again, I'm not going to say that I'm up to speed on the Santiago principles sitting here. I'm not. I'd be interested to know the size or scale of wealth that's at issue, or the source of. So, yeah, I mean, what is the fundamental goal that we want to have to achieve with this one sliver of what is minimal resource royalty or minimal resource revenue that we get in the NWT or in the Northwest Territories generally? Yeah, it's not really something that arguably any one of us alone would answer, but that through a conversation collectively that we can hopefully land on a place. Thanks.
Thank you, Minister. Mr. Rogers for follow-up. No follow-up from Mr. Rogers. Any other members' questions for the Minister on the Heritage Fund? Mr. Hawkins.
Yeah, I think Ms. Bullock was certainly getting in the direction that I was curious on, to the organic conversation of where it's going. I think you said commercial bonds or something like but it all sort of always comes back to as in the directions or the instructions. And I was curious as to where those instructions can be found as to what they're being sent with, specifically on how to do that. Is it built into the regulations that they're operating their full instructions off of? And if so, that's well within the department's ability to adjust. I'm just curious on how that's communicated to the members or the assembly. Thank you.
Thank you. Over to the minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So, I mean, you know, again, at its inception, when it was set up back 2012-ish, you know, could certainly look back to then as to the initial goals, but fundamentally the purpose really was to set aside this funding or this money in a place that would be fairly long-term, well, very long-term actually, and fairly risk-averse. So, yeah, that's reflected in the Act, it's been reflected in the policy, and it's been reflected in the regulations that we've had since that time, you know, subject to achieving that goal. So I'm happy to turn this thing. I think Kelly Luck's actually been here through all that evolution of process. I don't know that we were entirely prepared to talk about the whole history of that here today, but could certainly do that, or at least get an introduction, or can maybe provide a bit more. I mean, we don't have a historical necessarily slide deck here, but you know, could certainly also put that together and include it going forward. But also, maybe I'll just turn it over and see if Ms. Black wants to add anything. Thanks.
Go ahead, Ms. Black.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So way back in 2012, we put in, we didn't even have devolution yet, right? This was, the Heritage Fund itself was in anticipation of devolution and what were we going to do with those resources when they came. And then the Legislative Assembly at the time got a little excited and they put in seed money before we even had devolution, and that went in. But since it was such a small amount, we just rolled it into our regular cash management, and it was managed in our investment pools along with everything else under our Financial Administration Act and the regulations that go with that. So it was all into safe bonds. Then once we started getting the resource revenues under devolution and we were putting in a set amount every year, or the percentage, we then went, it was time to do something a little bit more sophisticated than what we do in our safe, very safe investment pools. And that was when we went out for contract for someone to manage the fund for us, cheaper than we could if we were to try to get subject matter experts in a position years in the government. You just can't do it, short answer. And at that point, we were then with the contracts and everything else, then we discussed with the winners what would be the appropriate investment strategy that one would want, having looked at what other investment strategies are out there for firms of funds of similar size. And we got the advice of their investment managers at that time, and that was how we set up the regulations, which were different than the Financial Administration Act regulations, which have to be a lot more safer. That's when we added in equities. And then since then, in our conversations, they say, you know, market's changing and it would really be helpful if we had this kind of safe, the fixed bonds again, we changed regulations again, and we do that, right? It's an investment strategy, and when we leave it to the investment managers themselves to decide which equities are going in there, but we have discussions about the type of equities. And again, it's on the safe side. And if I can just sort of veer off into this, advice on investment strategy, you have to remember if you're going to increase your risk, your equities, you're increasing your risk. And for a long-term thing, sometimes things can go off the rails, such that, like, if we were investing in 2008, for example, we would have, it'd be another 10 years after that to get the capital back that we would have lost, right? So again, that's a decision of investment strategy, but I'm actually not sure what the question is for how we're managing it. We are managing it based on a set framework that is clear and public to everyone because it's in the regulations, and then we have our investment managers that are just doing their jobs within those parameters. So is that the question that's being asked?
Thank you. Over to the member, Mr. Hawkins.
Well, without getting into my second question, I'd say is I think you're kind of getting at where the challenges and the transparency of those instructions are to the investor manager, because they certainly aren't typically brought to this table. I mean, I can't speak to what it's been like in my sabbatical years, but I'll certainly say that typically regulations are changed behind the scenes, and very rarely they're updated or pronounced in a manner that's relevant to members unless we stumble across them through some process. That isn't the case on every example, but that's certainly a case in some examples. And that's kind of where I was driving at, is what and where do the instructions to the investment managers come from? And you did say the regs, and that's sort of where I was getting at. Was curious as to where they might be. So, and how they get changed, I think you've already answered that question, so it's fine. You've done that. So that's it. The only other thing I'll say, Mr. Chairman, it's more of a comment, and because I know we're sort of wrapping up in that direction, is I do recognize things have changed. I mean, if you ask me about ESGs, you know, when I was here in 2012 and 13 and 14, I mean, nobody thought of environmental social governance funds as, you know, not that they didn't matter, it's just we never thought of it in the way, say, you would think about it 10 years later. That said, you know, I remember personally arguing for 2/3 voting on any withdrawal from the fund, unsuccessfully, but the reality, of course, is, as I finish off here, Mr. Chairman, is that, you know, all of us viewed devolution as, you know, the opportunity that was really coming, and I wouldn't want to do the anecdote down the pipe, but, you know, all of us saw it as a great opportunity, and it appears, again, in my sabbatical, it didn't prove out, you know, in the sense of the overrunneth of wealth that was going to hit our coffers at great strength. So, but as I finish off, I'll say at least something's better than nothing, and we've at least proven that piece. So something was better than nothing. So that said, it's just a comment. I wish it was way more robust than we dreamt it to be, and apparently it's not, but it's still something. Thank you.
Thank you. Does the minister have any response or comments?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I mean, yeah, something's definitely better than nothing. Don't disagree. And again, I wasn't here for exactly how it was being sold. That history, I think, probably, particularly given the lines of discussions here, is perhaps quite relevant to the Assembly's review of this, because devolution is really just, you know, bringing back responsibility for lands and natural resources. Oh, but not entirely, because the federal government remains responsible for Mackenzie Valley Land and Waters Board, and appoints members to that board and issues the directions to that board, and still takes back 50% of these revenues. So I don't know what was sold in terms of the Heritage Act. We can only say it's a really narrow sliver of the contributions of the mineral resource industry to the Northwest Territories that we're putting here. If it was sold otherwise, you know, yeah, you know, here we are. I think we should be clear about what it is, what it's for, why we have it, and what we want to see it be, and perhaps we do change the fundamental core instructions to the investors, and maybe we do change what we want to perhaps use this money for, and the term over which we want to do that. But those are fairly big questions, Mr. Chair. We're not going to pretend to have the answers today, nor should it necessarily be the Department of Finance alone that has that conversation, when it really is a species of review that should come to the Legislative Assembly and through a committee. So, but this has been a very good discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. And yeah, I would just suggest, I hope that we've got many viewers online and on the television, and that this is a prompt to them that certainly we are hoping to hear from people on this one, and the committee can discuss this one and discuss how we want to engage with the public on this, because I agree. This is a conversation for the public to be having, because this is ultimately their money. Just going back to committee, does anyone have follow-up questions? We have some time left with the minister if we have burning questions that we want to get off our chests. Not seeing hands flying up. I do have a few that I'd like to cover, if committee will indulge me. Yeah, I think the one that I would start with is just about, it's something that I'm kind of wondering about, and I'm not sure if you'll have an answer to it, but there is a potential argument to be made that revenues from non-renewable resources should not be included in the territorial formula financing calculation, because they're capital assets which can only be used once rather than permanent income. Following this logic, if the GNWT were to put all of our non-renewable resource revenue into the fund, spending only the income from those funds, then they could potentially claim that these revenues should be excluded and only fund income included in the fiscal capacity calculations. So my question from this kind of idea is, has the GNWT advocated or considered advocating to have non-renewable resource revenue excluded from the territorial formula financing calculation? And if so, have they, I'm guessing they haven't been successful because it's not happening currently, but my question is, has that conversation even happened?
Well, yeah, again, I don't know the history prior to my own time, and so I can't necessarily say when this was being set up, what kind of response we necessarily might have gotten back from the federal government at the time, nor at the time of devolution. But it is the money that's in here, the 50% offset. It is an offset, so it's not that we don't get it back. Sorry, hang on. So this is where, so you get the territorial formula financing amount, and it's 2 years later that they then look and say whether or not there's an amount that we have to return to them. So to the extent that there's ever royalties, they do get offset a couple years on. So, you know, it's slightly different. The extent to which that actually impacts anything depends a whole lot on the amount that we're having to offset in a particular year. So how much royalties we get in a particular year. Beyond that, I will say, we had looked at, and I certainly had asked early on, the extent to which our deal under devolution is similar to the equalization type approach used by provinces. I definitely did not prepare that for kind of question for today, but my understanding overall is that we generally are ahead of where the provinces are at, and they aren't getting a lot of traction in their concerns that they raise quite consistently to have their own better deals struck under equalization. So, and there's a lot of them, and they have a lot of MPs, and it's still not getting a whole lot of attention in that respect. So, yeah, if we wanted to have another conversation at some point about equalization versus territorial formula financing, I think that's probably the bigger one, as opposed to the sliver of this fund, which does get offset over 2 years. Because territorial formula financing obviously is, 70-some% of our budget. And that's the one that if we were to look at that and understand how that works, understand that formula, understand how that compares to the deal the provinces have, that certainly, Mr. Chair, I'm happy to try to do that. Don't necessarily have the capacity here today, but what I'm trying to kind of get at is that it's and even looking at all of the money of the non-renewable resource industry, so taxes. Well, taxes on direct income from the corporations themselves, taxes from the employees who work there, taxes from those who work in the transportation sector that work there. Like, again, how far down the chain do I go? Pretty sure the federal government's going to stop that train as quick as they can, because I suddenly have all of our own source revenues now, or a good chunk of them have some sort of connection to the resource industry. So anyhow, I'll stop, Mr. Chair. I know I'm now on a sort of rabbit hole. Yeah, territorial formula financing, how it's calculated, whether it's fair. I mean, Newfoundland has got their own view of equalization right now. They're taking the federal government to court. We'll see where that lands.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm not sure if the minister has played poker before, but I believe you're not supposed to show the government your hand if you're planning to take all this revenue and shuffle it off to the Heritage Fund, but here we are in a public briefing. And as long as they're not watching, we could potentially still pull off this scheme. The next question I have is Section 5.1 of the Act does state that an annual report needs to be prepared. My impression is that the department has considered their reporting through public accounts as fulfilling that report, but there are some aspects of the report that the accountability framework lays out that aren't included. So my question is, why has the department not been submitting annual reports, and is it their plan to start doing so? Yeah, if they could just kind of address the annual reporting aspect, I'd appreciate that.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So, Mr. Chair, there is a separate report that's done. It's just that it is done within the process of the public accounting. So it's, yeah, I mean, we can pull it out, be in the same time frame. So whether it's in the same broad document or separately, I mean, yeah, I think it's an appendix right now in the public account. So you can take it out and call it something different. Yeah, if that's what, if that is right, and maybe I misunderstood, people were asking for a separate place for it. Like, it's going to be the same report, just in a different place, so that can be done.
Okay, thanks. We'll have a look at that and get back. Mr. Hawkins, it looks like you have a question that's come up, by all means.
No, not a question, Stephen. I like the idea of it annually reported in the budget as part of the revenue scheme, you know, as whether it's appendices or appropriate, or a table, or in a plain language form. But I prefer that. If you want to report in any other form that you view you're meeting your obligations to the Assembly, that's fine too. But I'm referring to specifically the request built around public consumption and usability of information. I mean, it's like handing someone the document saying, budget document that's 2 inches thick and saying, well, it's in there. So anyway, so I would say if you choose to do other things, no problem. If you choose to meet your obligations in different forms, no problem. But I certainly like the rabbit hole direction we went in with that one, as in that's a great place to put it because that's an easy one for anyone who can start.
Thank you. More of a comment, but if the minister has a response, now's the time.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. I think it'd be a question that we need to wrap our heads around in terms of the public accounts obviously is looking back at a fiscal year, budget is looking forward to the fiscal year, but that there are documents in the budget documents every year. There's an analysis piece that goes in there. There's a whole little booklet that goes in that has sort of financial analysis in it. So, and that's what when I was saying budget documents, I was thinking of that piece. So that is meant to be accessible. It does have little, write-ups and lots of charts, which hopefully are fairly accessible to the public, and that's where I'm thinking we could consider maybe adding a section on this. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Hawkins, do you have a follow-up on that?
No, we're on the same page on that one. So whatever reasonable and readable form it's in there is certainly a great way to start.
Thank you. The next question I had was, has the government considered putting more of our non-renewable resource revenue into the Heritage Fund than we currently put in? Is that something that's been contemplated?
And Mr. Chair, meaning something other than the royalties, licensing, and fees, or a different percentage?
In this case, I'm asking for a different percentage of what we bring in. So currently we put a certain percentage away of what we bring in, and the rest kind of ends up in the in capital investments, as was illustrated at the beginning. So we consider taking a larger amount and putting it straight into the Heritage Fund instead of investing in capital.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So yeah, so we wouldn't be, so there's a 50% that is the offset with the federal government, the 25 net, or sort of 12.5 that goes to Indigenous governments for devolution. Those two really, I would say, are not really too open for a whole lot of change, I suspect. It's the net fiscal benefit portion, which I think we had it at slide 6, so it was, just under 10 million for 22-23. That's the portion that we're saying, you could take more of that and put it away. We certainly can. That's amend the act to change that percentage allocation. It still gets into the conversation of the purpose of the fund. Is the purpose of the fund to really just be tuck this away for 10 assemblies from now? Is that how we define investment in the future? Or are we going to reconsider how we define an investment in the future? And maybe it's not capital assets in the forms of horizontal or vertical structures, and maybe it's something else. Maybe it's some form of investment that we all agree is an investment in the future. But if you take it out right now, it definitely takes it away from the view that horizontal or vertical infrastructure is an investment in the future, because that's where it's going. So yeah, the act can be changed and the percentages can be changed. it will change where that money goes and what it is currently being used for, which right now is to help support, okay, I can make a very direct comparison for you. 9.5 million in 22-23. Well, 8 million right now is the sum total that we have to spend on chip sealing across the entire Northwest Territories. And I can assure you, everybody wants to have their road chip sealed. So no more chip sealing. That's kind of the balance that we get into is, and does that help investment in the future? Again, I've had the opportunity to be in a couple of smaller communities recently, and those communities are telling me that they can't get their goods back and forth because they're stuck because of the roads. So again, it's actually a very interesting political conversation to get into. What is the way that we want to support future? How much are we going to do it, and how do we try to use this one sort of sliver of money to do it?
Thank you. No, and I'm certainly hoping that through committee's investigation of this, we can prompt and have that discussion, because I think it's, as you've been saying, I mean, I've got lots of questions here that I think I can put to you, but are just as appropriately kind of put to the public. And I really do generally agree with you that this is a conversation for the public to have about their heritage fund and how much they want to see this invested in the future versus spending on now. So it's a key question I think the public should be engaged on. I'm going to ask questions just because we've got the time with you, and we might as well kind of get your comments on the record if we can. So the current management of the fund has us putting 25% in equities to compare it to Norway's Heritage Fund, which is, as far as I understand, the best heritage fund on earth. Theirs is about 60% equity, 40% fixed income. I've got Wyoming as a comparison here, which is 55 equity, 45 fixed. So I'd be curious to hear from the Department of Finance whether they think that the way that we have this fund set up right now, is it overly conservative to achieve the goal of maximizing long-term returns without undue risk? Curious to hear from the financial experts on it if they'd be interested in offering opinion. This could again be a question for the public to look into as well.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just as a starting point, any of the Scandinavian countries, Norway, Finland, are in a pretty different place in terms of the kinds of revenues they're bringing in from their oil and gas revenues. And so it is arguably easier, and I say arguably easier, to be less risk averse when you have a lot more money coming in. Their starting place as national governments in terms of having a national fund is also a different starting place. And lastly, the starting place of the population, where I do think we have to, looking at the future of the territory, who the territory is composed of, we have the highest percentage in Canada of residential school survivors. We're behind than the rest of Canada, than even Alberta, let's say. So, I would pull a comparison to what's going on in Alberta with their resource revenues, but they are not at the same starting place as we are. So, those are kind of comments on your question. Again, I'm going to turn this to Kelly because she's the one that's spent the most time on the fund directly and in terms of the investment managers, and just get a sense, if I could, from her as to if that's a question that can be parsed out a little bit, please.
Ms. Pluck, by all means.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. There isn't really all much more you can say. I mean, we have you cannot compare ourselves, as the minister said, to Norway or anything else. It's a sovereign country, right? And they have a whole bunch of criteria that is directed at sovereign funds, which is we're not going to invest in our own country. We're going to make sure it's outside of ours. And then we have other funds that, like from other less subnational governments, that are saying we're doing our fund so that it has to invest in economic development from that jurisdiction. Well, you couldn't even do that here because we don't have the economic development to actually invest in that would actually give you a return, like, to be perfectly frank, right? So when you're doing an investment strategy and you're looking at the comparable funds that we have, then you have to decide, again, are we conservative with public money? Is it do we want to take more of a risk because it is long term, and at which point then we could up the amount that's equities, but you've got, again, it's your investment preferences that you're talking about when it comes to an investment strategy. And comparing yourself to another fund is also, it's fine. You have the same kind of goals and the same kind of principles, but it's what you expect in terms of risk to what you want as a return that you have to think about, and within the size of the fund that you have. So you cannot compare yourself to Norway with its close to $1 trillion, to ours, which is right now not even 50 million yet, right?
Thank you. And I do appreciate the sober reminder that we're maybe shooting a little high, but I like to be aspirational. I'm going to, and I might suggest that, you know, as the committee looks at this, it would probably be better to kind of compare ourselves to the vast breadth of funds that are out there. There's quite a few of them. Maybe Norway is not the best comparator, but surely we can find some comparator funds that might be more applicable. Certainly there's provinces in Canada and otherwise. So I'm going to put it back to committee. If there are any last questions, I'm not seeing any, so I think that we can probably wrap up this briefing. Wanted to thank the Minister and her staff for taking the time for what I think is the beginning of this discussion. And certainly I think committee will have further questions coming up and be engaging with the public as we move forward with this review. So thank you very much for presenting. I don't know if you have any closing comments or any closing thoughts to share. I'm seeing a no. So thank you very much, and we'll conclude the public portion of this briefing. After we do that, if I could just get committee to stick around for a debrief, that would be appreciated. So thanks very much, and thanks to everyone who is watching. We always appreciate you tuning in.